It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. We're doing something different this week as American Forum takes you on location to our day-long National Summit on Race and the Presidency, held recently at the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta, Georgia. It was an amazing event to see people from all across the political spectrum come together for frank, open discussions about the racial tensions that continue to plague our country and the anxiety felt by so many Americans about whether our nation can continue moving forward. At the center of the discussion was Johnny Mack, head of the Drum Major Institute, an organization founded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., now led by his son, Martin III, that has been in serious dialogue with the Trump White House on issues of race. Here's a snippet from radio host Michael Eric Dyson and Harvard professor Elizabeth Hinton on a panel broadcast that day on Facebook Live.
Whiteness is spoiled. It is often unconscious. It insists upon its own innocence to reproduce its own power, and it refuses to acknowledge its privilege, and it will not say it's white. And so what we have to do is to encourage white brothers and sisters to see Donald Trump is the product, not the producer.
It's really a time for new discussions and a turn away from this idea that pathology explains conditions in low-income Black communities. It's those assumptions we see playing out in this language of dependency that really steer the elections. And Trump even saying during his inauguration speech, American carnage in Chicago, as if crime and violence are somehow innate.
Later in the program, we opened up the discussion to include dozens of other participants, including at one point former Acting Attorney General Sally Yates. This was not a pep rally for any cause, candidate, or point of view. Instead, it was a discussion about ways not to demonize those we disagree with, how to work together to find solutions in an incredibly difficult and divisive area, and to draw wisdom from the experiences of our nation's past leaders. That's what American Forum is all about. It was all a part of the Miller Center's year-long effort to gather experts and, in a nonpartisan way, search for solutions to the most vexing problems that are already facing President Trump in his first year in office. One of the best things about the summit we organized was that it began with a private meeting of national leaders on race, including former Attorney General Eric Holder and Black Lives Matter leader DeRay McKesson, along with local activists in Atlanta, law enforcement personnel, political players, scholars, students, and citizens to discuss how to jumpstart a constructive next chapter in our national dialogue on race. Others in the room represented the views of the Koch brothers, who perhaps surprisingly to some, have been strong advocates for criminal justice reform. So it was a conversation about how to have progress, even if it requires unorthodox alliances. So American Forum is on the road this week from that summit, and now we'll bring you a dialogue at the end of that day with two of the key participants from two different generations of leadership. Eric Holder was the first African-American Attorney General, serving in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2015, along with DeRay McKesson, a national leader in Black Lives Matter, who came to prominence following the police shootings in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. So, DeRay, we've come to the end of the first African-American presidency. As an activist, someone who cares about this, what's your assessment of what happened in the Obama years?
Yeah, so I think about that election was monumental in so many ways. That the symbolism of his presidency is something that I think we'll continue to see the benefits of. And I think that any of us, we saw the organizing that happened around that election we hadn't seen before at that scale. Like we saw the house parties, the emails, it was just so different. I think that's really important. I'm also mindful that the landscape of hope changed dramatically during his presidency with the death of Trayvon and so many other things. The way people thought about the promise of America and definitely the promise of the presidency, I think changed, and people pushed for Obama to be stronger on race than I think he was in some ways. I will say we met with him twice, and I remember the last meeting we had, it was 4 hours, and it was a long, good 4 hours, but it was a long 4 hours. And in the end, he was like pushing the DOJ to think about like how could funding be used as a lever. Like he was a thoughtful participant in those conversations. I'm not sure that actually ever translated into the public ways that he talked about either the protests or about race. And I think that was in some ways disappointing. But when I think about the administration was, I think, more aggressive at the end than they were during the beginning. So the work on mass incarceration, the work on definitely the police and the rhetoric around the police was just so much tougher. I think that they had, if I had to bet, I think that they had planned to just punt some things off to Hillary if she's going to win. Like they were going to set up the foundation with the task force, and Hillary was going to implement some of those things, and then that just didn't happen.
It is true, I think, to correct me if I'm wrong, that there was a sense within the Obama White House to stay away to some degree from the more complicated issues of race, certainly from the really complex criminal justice reform issues, to not deal with that so much in the first term, wait for the second term because of the political volatility of it. Is that in fact how it played out? And or was there, as DeRay suggests, a sense that we'll get the ball rolling, but the next president is going to be a Democrat, will be a successor, and they'll carry it forward? Is that a?
I wouldn't say that all was placed in the second term. We did significant things in the first term as well. I mean, among the things was to reverse the Ashcroft doctrine, which essentially said that every prosecutor, when you had a case, you had to charge the maximum amount when you were faced with a particular fact situation. I reversed that. That had an impact. And we also began the work that I thought was necessary for the Smart on Crime initiative that we announced in the second term, which was to research, do a lot of research so we understood exactly what the nature of the issues were, what are the kinds of problems that we needed to deal with. And then we formed working groups within the Justice Department that reported back to me with a series of proposals that I used in making the Smart on Crime announcement, I guess, in front of the ABA in San Francisco. So it was part of a process.
One of the things we do at the Miller Center is research into the history of the presidency and trying to find lessons for the present from things that happened in the past. You guys earlier today heard a clip of a recording of President Johnson.
Are you having any disturbances in Philadelphia?
We had a shooting yesterday of a young 16-year-old boy by a policeman that was no good.
Did the policeman just lose his head?
Yeah, quick. Quick with a revolver.
Kill him?
Yep, right through the chest, right through the heart.
What was the boy doing?
Larceny, robbery, 16-year-old, unarmed. It's just a terrible thing.
Did he threaten him or anything?
No, he hollered to him to stop, and the boy ran, and he fired. Killed him.
What's your reaction, DeRay, to hearing a tape like that, audio like that from 50 years ago that sounds a lot like what might have happened a week ago?
Yeah, I think that what is real is that the rhetoric of progress has not matched the reality of progress in people's lives in so many ways. And I think that tape is a reflection of that. Also, it's a reminder that these issues around the conflict between police and communities has been around for a very long time. That what has changed in this moment is that people now have the tools to show people in real time things that are happening. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, like those sort of things allow us to be our own storytellers. That, as people of color, we always face these issues of erasure, and erasure often manifests in two ways. One is either the story is never told or it's told by everybody but us.
Let me ask you a sort of philosophical question of that. As a historian, I've argued for a long time and still would, and I think it's a clinical observation that in the end, any assessment of President Obama's tenure has to view him as a successful president and a very historic president. I mean, he's historic just by virtue of having been the first African-American president, but also the tremendous legislative achievements of the first term in particular. I mean, there's really no way not to view him as a empirically historic president. But having said that, there was so much hope that connected to his presidency, such an expectation of so much change, and then it turned out, whatever the exact measure is, that things were a lot more complicated than it seemed in January of 2009. Just it was a lot harder to tackle a lot of issues, and that maybe there was an overconfidence in what one president could accomplish. If that's the case, does that tell us the inverse now? That if there's a lot of anxiety and worry about President Trump, maybe that's overstated. Maybe that's as exaggerated as perhaps the hope was around President Obama. And if so, then maybe folks who are motivated around this issue shouldn't be quite as alarmed as they are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. It may be that we see President Trump at this time as somebody who is not as capable as he might prove to be, or the people around him may not be as ideologically driven as they appear to me now to be. And it may be that by the end, the administration is more successful than we think now that it might be.
This has been the most exhausting beginning of a presidency, because every day you're like, whoa, I didn't even know the president could do that quickly. And part of that is that we haven't seen a president use their power this sort of recklessly before. And Obama would never have been able to get away with wielding power like this. Like, the public pushback from the left itself, forget the right, would have been so enormous. And what we see right now is like a rubber stamp Congress with the Republicans, that they are just letting him do this, even in spite of the issues with Russia, with his family, with the businesses, right? All of the no taxes. You're like, the confirmation hearings. You're like, is there a process? Are there? I think the standards have gone.
Well, that's I think something that'll be interesting to see. What do Republicans do as this administration develops? And especially as we get into an election year in 2018, when their names will be on the ballot. All
Right.
of the members of the House, 1/3 of the Senate. What do Republicans, and in particular, what do moderate Republicans do with regard to their support of the Trump administration? I think that's something to watch in Washington, D.C.
And do you think, Attorney General Holder, at the end of the administration, there was such a public push to talk about local prosecutors and the importance of local prosecutors? Do you think that was the right push?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's important to, it's never either or. I mean, I think too often we always think it's got to be one or the other. And I think in this case, as in others, it's a question of both. Certainly the federal government has to be focused on these criminal justice issues in the way that I think we were appropriately. But I think also people need to focus who on a day-to-day basis is making the assessments about how criminal justice policy is being carried out. There are about 2 million people in the United States who are incarcerated. Only about 200,000 of them or so are in the federal system. The vast majority of people are in the state systems. Decisions about prosecutions are made by local prosecutors, DAs, assistant DAs, and focus needs to be paid on the kinds of decisions they're making, and then obviously what the local police are doing.
And one of the issues that any attorney general confronts, and certainly you confronted, is as you were just describing, that so relatively few of the people incarcerated in the United States are in the federal system. And so the direct power of a president to change anything that relates to incarceration is relatively limited, except by inspiration or by example. And so you guys could make fairly big changes in the federal prison system without it actually moving the needle a whole lot in terms of the whole.
Although, to be fair, I mean, there were states that had moved well before we announced the Smart on Crime initiative, who had done a variety of things in some red states as well.
Texas and Georgia.
Texas and Georgia, exactly right, where you would have thought, well, that's not the kind of thing you would expect from a red state, and yet they did these things and saw that they didn't spend as much as they had previously on their criminal justice system, and didn't see any rise in the crime rate.
Does that suggest that there is that if we flipped this around, instead of that over the last 8 years, the hope and the expectation was that federal policy, Department of Justice policy about reform in these areas would ultimately chart a path for more and more reform by many states and localities? Does what you just said suggest that now that should be flipped around and the emphasis should be on red states like Texas and Georgia that have pulled off big changes that, with good benefits in an political environment that maybe we would have thought wouldn't be possible? Are those the examples of what the rest of the country should be looking at? And does that speak to some sort of possible working alliance between conservatives and liberals?
I think that possibility exists. I mean, I think a lot of what you saw in the States was budget driven, where you simply could not continue to do what had been done in the States without busting state budgets. I think the possibility exists that, to the extent I'm concerned about losing the progress that we've made in criminal justice reform efforts, that there might be taken up by the states. That states might resist efforts that are placed on them, however, done by the federal government, to resist those efforts and to continue to innovate, to try different kinds of things, to be reform-minded in unexpected places.
What was your reaction as a young American man to, on the one hand, the sort of what I have to imagine was something of a whiplash sensation of there's the election of the first African-American president that seemed to, and I think at some level did, indicate a fairly astonishing degree of progress in American life. But then within a really short period of time, we're in an era that is maybe the most racially riven of at least the last 2 or 3 decades, I think.
I think before I had a less nuanced understanding of progress. I was like, there's progress, right? And I was like, not different water fountains anymore, not segregated school. I think that when we think about these big markers of progress, I think that I've been seduced by that in some ways, even though, both my parents were addicted to drugs. My father raised us. My mother left when I was 3. So I grew up in a community of recovery and understood that part really well. But it wasn't until I went to Ferguson and I taught, so I understood education disparities. But I went to Ferguson. I'll never forget the second night that I was in St. Louis was the first night of the curfew. If any of you remember that, it was a midnight curfew, 8 o'clock, we started getting tear gassed. And I remember getting tear gas for the first time, and I was like, this is not the America I thought I knew, right? That I didn't do anything. The police killed Mike. We didn't do anything. We shouldn't have to protest, right? We shouldn't have to be outside. We're out here and we are running from people with rifles, and we didn't do anything. And it was in that moment that I was like, something is wrong, right? This is broken. And I was one of many people who said, we'll put whatever we can on the line. And when I think about protest, it is this idea of telling the truth in public. And we were using our bodies to tell the truth that Mike should be alive. So that to me was one of the life-changing moments of dissonance where it was just this is wrong. And I think what we saw all across the country is people stand up. I think that what we've seen, since the Trump presidency is even more people come to the streets and say something just isn't right here. I think the test will be, can we turn that into power? I think that we have definitely shifted the conversation, and I think that was hard work to do, but that was not the win. That the win will be structural change.
And I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the notion that I think another thing that's kind of taken hold, that the Obama years were more racially riven. I think the fact of his presidency, the fact that an African American, a black man who was president of the United States, pushed into the public sphere a racial consciousness that perhaps we didn't have, an interest in racial issues. Certainly there were incidents, but I don't think that, in the years before, the country was, much better racially than we were in the Obama years. Perhaps they were not as discussed. That didn't mean, on the other hand, that the abuses that, that put DeRay in the street and others were not occurring, or that we had made such great progress that somehow or other this progress had been reversed under the Obama years. I think there was a discussion, a focus on things racial that we had simply not done for an extended period of time. But I don't want people to think that things, I don't believe, got racially worse during the Obama years. I simply don't believe that.
Has there been an escalation in the number of police killings of unarmed African American men, or has there simply been an escalation of cameras capturing these events?
I don't know. And getting back to what DeRay said earlier, we have not had a system that has kept numbers. So we don't have an ability to look at 2016 and say, how did that compare to 1975? We can talk about incarceration rates, we can talk about numbers of people in prison, but for whatever reason, we have not. And I'm calling on our government to start keeping these statistics.
Pizza Hut knows where your pizza is, everywhere across the country. We're collecting rainwater. We know rainwater in swamps in the, on treetops in random places with no people, but we don't know the number of people the police kill, which is a fascinating fact, right?
No, let's get it out there. Let's talk about, let's acquire the numbers of police shootings. And let's understand also that some of these shootings are going to be justified, all right? And let's be prepared for that as well. But let's face, for the first time in our history, let's face, in a very honest way, a frank way, the racial issues that continue to divide us. We are really adept as a nation, and it's understandable, in kind of pushing to the side, putting back in the bottle racial issues that unless we talk about them, unless we're prepared to ask hard questions and face some painful truths, we're never going to make progress. We got to do that. We have to do that. There has to be this dialogue between people in law enforcement and the communities that they serve that maybe serves as the foundation. But then I think there's some really concrete things that have to be done. The 21st Century Policing Report that that comes out of the Obama administration. I think there are really concrete things there. I think the 21, 22 policy proposals. But in some ways it comes down to dealing with the question of implicit bias that affects Black police officers as well as white police officers. And then the question of use of force. How do you escalate so that your first response isn't to take out your gun and fire it? We want to keep police officers safe, but I think with that dialogue and then with that kind of training, that we could, I think, pretty substantially reduce the number of negative interactions.
At the same time, let's also acknowledge that in the course of the campaign, not just on his election night speech, but when President-elect Trump said, "I want to be the president of all people," but there also were some other times, even when he was giving these degrading descriptions of Black neighborhoods, after one of the shootings, police shootings that occurred during the campaign, and after someone showed him video of one of these sequences, he then publicly said, "Well, when I saw that video, what I saw was a man doing all the things he's supposed to do," meaning follow the directions of the police officer and put his hands up, and then he got shot and killed. And Trump was saying, "And that didn't look right to me." And so there are these glimmers of something else.
It's one glimmer.
One glimmer. Okay, all right.
I don't know if they're glimmers.
So, by no means am I trying to make the case that that President Trump is a new civil rights hero, but he's got a lot of work to be that guy.
But it's obvious that there's going to be a test, that there is going to be an incident in which there's going to be something on tape that some police officer is going to shoot a Black man someplace. Unfortunately, I think this is just likely to happen. And then the question will be, it will depend on what the tape actually shows. Then we'll know. We'll get a sense of what this Attorney General, what this President, what the Justice Department's reaction is going to be to, as we have seen in the past, the community unrest that is likely to be generated by the incident. And so we won't have to worry about glimmer, or about theoretical kinds of things. The proof will be in the pudding.
And so let's say that crisis comes, DeRay. What is it that you're expecting from President Trump, or what could President Trump do in that situation that would make you, at least for a moment, consider some reassessment of what his motivations really are?
A part of me thinks that they are hoping for an incident to happen so that there can be something that is so wrong that they use that to paint everybody as like a bad person who should be in jail. And that was one of my nervousness. That was one of the core pieces of nervousness around the march that happened after the inauguration, that I think his base was waiting for somebody to get hurt or somebody to get shot during something to go so wrong that they could use that to to vilify all of us in a way that I think would be really damaging. I don't know, maybe Sessions comes out and is this beacon of fairness or something. I don't think we've gotten any indication that that's going to be the case. And I am worried, again, if he's already said as much that he doesn't believe in the Civil Rights Division, right? He's not defended that office. And that is, in my understanding as an activist, that has been the DOJ's main lever with the police work. So in the absence of that, I don't know what that looks like.
If there was one thing you were going to tell him, one thing you need to think about President Trump before this day of crisis comes that you've just predicted, and just out of a sense of basic patriotism that none of us wants terrible things to happen in our country, and if you were going to give him one piece of advice to be ready for that day, what would that be?
I'd say think long term. Don't think about short term political expediency. That history. You want to think about how history is going to view you in particular, how history is going to view your administration. Understand the history of these things, and to grow. Maybe not go with that first instinct that you have, but to try to listen to people who are activists, try to get other voices. Listen to other people before you get out there and make that first pronouncement. Don't reflexively react to that which you see. Don't react in a political way.
Dre McKesson, Eric Holder, thanks for being part of this conversation.
Okay.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
You've been watching American Forum, on location this week at the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta. For more about our National Summit on Race and the Presidency, go to the website for our first-year project, POTUS2017.org. To see other episodes of American Forum or read a transcript of today's dialogue, visit us at millercenter.org. If you'd like to send me a comment, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is @DouglasBlackman. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.